Hello and good evening. I'm Teresa Munoz. I'm writer in residence at Green College. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the launch of Philip Holden's collection of short stories, Heaven Has Eyes. I would like to begin by acknowledging with gratitude and respect that the land on which we gather is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'm very glad that Philip is launching his book here at Green College at UBC, where he was once a student rep on the planning committee, and a visiting scholar, although I only met him last week. First published in 2016, Heaven Has Eyes is a remarkable work of short stories ranging geographically from Singapore to the UK to Western Canada. It finds inspiration from migration and historical archives and looks at the complexities of belonging, moving, and the desire to find home. Our author, Philip Holden, has lived in 3 continents in the UK, Canada, and Singapore, where he taught and researched Singapore and Southeast Asian writing in a 3-decade-long career. He is the author of critical, geographical, and fictional writing, exploring the connections between social and historical narratives and questions of identity, belonging, and agency. Before his academic career, he worked in children's theater as a union organizer and as a residential social worker with refugees. Now a registered clinical counselor, he explores the intersection of storytelling and mental health through work in guided autobiography and facilitating lived experience stories. He leads a migratory life between Singapore and Vancouver, Canada. So we're going to hear Philip read and present, and then he and I will have a Q&A about the book before opening to audience questions, which also includes our online questions. So let's give Philip a hand.
Just to say thank you very much to Teresa for that lovely introduction. And also thank you to Emma, thank you to Heather, for other people who've brought me to the college. I also see a lot of friends and a lot of people who've actually been influential on my writing and my life here. And I can't possibly thank you all, but I would want to thank a particular person, and that's Patricia Merivale, who is seated here, who was my supervisor when I was a doctoral student, all those many, many years ago. Right? So just to say thank you, and thank you for being on this land. I thought what I'd do is I'd just talk for maybe about 10 minutes about the collection, Heaven Has Eyes. I'll read a little bit from it, and then Teresa and I will go into a dialogue about some of the issues that arise. And I think also interesting to hear her perspective too, as another kind of transnational writer, and some shared parallels, maybe some differences too, right? But Heaven Has Eyes really, I guess, it comes out of a life spent in 3 different places. The first would be London, and I was in London as an undergraduate, especially from 1980 to 1984. I chose the British Museum reading room here because London's also been a place where I go back to and I do research. It's a place of archival work for me. So London as that certain moment in my life, and then again as a space of archival research and archival work. The second is Vancouver. I chose a cherry blossom just because I was in Vancouver, first of all, for that period, 1989 to 94, as a graduate student doing my doctoral work. I went to Taiwan for a year, but I was in Vancouver at that time. And coming back to Vancouver again and again. And as a sort of, I guess, especially the natural world in Vancouver, being very close to that nature was something I very, very much appreciated. And then finally, and this is the bulk of my life, is Singapore. And this picture is actually of the old Bukit Timah campus of the National University of Singapore, which was founded in the 1920s. So I came to Singapore in 1994, and all my academic career actually was in Singapore. And as Teresa mentioned, I went to this strange sort of metamorphosis where I became the person who taught Singapore and Southeast Asian writing at the National University of Singapore for many, many years. And Singapore is central maybe to the story collection, but these other spaces also matter in other kinds of ways. And in 2016, I published this collection of short stories, Heaven Has Eyes, right, which is the first collection that was actually published in Singapore, right? And in this collection, maybe a few concerns. The first would be what I called everyday spaces. As someone who'd come to Singapore, start to inhabit these spaces, Things like my mother-in-law's living room, housing and development board flats, you can see here, coffee shops, those kind of things. Becoming part of those spaces, describing those spaces, being immersed in these spaces. A second thing was what I call kind of undersides, that these spaces also had other dimensions. So you might be in a coffee shop, and who might you be sitting next to? Well, it might be the executioner, an executioner who executes people in Changi prison, who also would visit coffee shops as well, right? Singapore having a very high rate of actual capital punishment. So that kind of underside you might see. Another underside I've shown here, which also features in the stories too, is opposition rallies. And Singapore, as some of you know, and many of you will know about Singapore, has had the same party in government since independence, since self-rule in 1959, independence in 1965. And the opposition is fairly weak, does have some seats in Parliament. But every 5 years there's an election, and there's a sudden strange outpouring of enthusiasm. The ruling party's rallies get maybe 200 or 300 people coming. But opposition rallies have these huge, massive rallies. And I was curious about these as kind of phenomenon, these kind of undersides, these things you don't normally see, and then things that suddenly erupt or suddenly arrive, right? Archives, I became fascinated with archives, digging around in archives. The fact that archives are always incomplete, they're always partial. What's the duty of a fiction writer? Should you try to fill up the gaps in the archive? Or should you show attention to problems in the archives or things that are missing in the archive? That's a question there. Crossings, there's a story called Mud Skippers, and this is a mud skipper, if some of you will know what I've seen it is. But this strange thing that lives between water and land. Is it a fish? Is it an amphibian? Where does it actually occupy? And maybe the stories also, in this story, there's also a character who is a bit like a mud skipper. It wasn't one character, who live between different worlds, right? So this kind of idea in the stories, I think, of living between different worlds. And even just within Singapore, this strange thing of being part of a Singapore Chinese family and then going and teaching Singapore writing at university or doing archival research, but also maybe living, having come from another world, coming to feel at home in Singapore and exploring that kind of sense of belonging and crossing and those things. And then the final thing I thought I'd put down was fathers, right? And you may well recognize some of these national fathers. This is Singapore's first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, and Pierre Trudeau, both of whom feature in some of the stories, right? And so I was interested in, and there is actually, and I'll read from it a little bit later, there is an incident in which Lee Kuan Yew actually came to UBC campus, and actually was in the faculty club as it was then for a time. We'll come back to that. So some connections in that kind of way. But I think I also realized later at that time my father was aging. So my own connection to my father was becoming quite important to me and to think about that. So that was the first collection. And then 10 years later, what happened is a couple of years ago, a friend of mine who Ji Leong, who actually is the publisher of with Gordy Boy in New York, a Singaporean living in New York. Just sort of, I'd written a short story for the journal he runs, and he said, "Do you have any more stories?" And I said, "Well, yes, I do. I've got a few. I've worked on a few, right, in that time. Do you want to do a new edition? Do you want to write some new stories? Do you want to add some new stories? Do you want to take some out?" And so the second edition comes. It's only in North America. The previous one was only in Singapore. And this one has 4 new stories and 4 stories taken out. Right? And just some things that maybe have come up in this new collection of stories. Before we said fathers, so now I'm interested in uncles. And if people who know these characters will know who these are the other founding fathers of Singapore, right? But I think maybe not quite so senior as Lee Kuan Yew in the public imagination. So there's Goh Keng Swee, who is Singapore's economic architect, and I want to write a story about him. The very good-looking young man at the bottom down there is actually S. Rajaratnam, and Rajaratnam became Singapore's first Minister of of Culture in 1959, and then for the first foreign minister in 1965. Had a very distinguished career, but also spent 12 years of his life in London from 1935 to 1947, during the war years. Met his Hungarian wife there. Lived in this multicultural boarding house, right? So were his ideas about multiculturalism that he then propagated in Singapore, where did they come from? Did they come from his reading, or did they come from his lived experience? I was quite curious about that. And then the final person here, the final uncle, is someone who lost out in history. These two people won in history in a way. They became celebrated, they became part of government. Lim Chin Siong. And Lim Chin Siong was a charismatic leader in the People's Action Party, the same party that Lee Kuan Yew founded. In the early 1960s, the party split, and Lim went into opposition. He'd been imprisoned by the British already, and he now got imprisoned by the new national government too, which happens quite a lot in these kind of histories. And then in the late 60s, Lim actually had to go into exile. He had mental health issues, and so he went to exile in London for 10 years. So again, the London connection, the connection to the other parts of the world, right? And then the final thing I think maybe to say also is, Teresa mentioned the counselling issue, and yes, I went through training as a counsellor in the last few years, and I think one of the interesting things about counselling is that I think a lot of counselling is actually telling stories, right? And it's telling a better story, right? And it's telling a better story of yourself. And I think also that whereas the material that you have in the counselling moment is completely confidential and completely ephemeral, the dramatic situation of counselling or therapy is actually a very interesting one to write stories about. There's something about that investigative, that two people, strangers, getting to know each other, that investigative thing going on, that actually I found very, very fertile for trying to think through how to write a story, how to structure a story. Right? And the final thing I just thought I just mentioned here is something I've called self as archive. And that's maybe the sense of getting older. And some people here are older than me, some people are younger, right? But as you age, I think there's a certain sense in which you start looking back rather than forwards. And you start looking back at certain times of your life, and that becomes material for your fiction. So Rajaratnam is in London in the 1940s as a student. I was in London in the 1980s as an undergraduate student, living in fairly similar kinds of houses. What happens there? What intersections are possible, right? And I think that's another new thing in this collection, right? So that's the introduction, and then I thought I'd just, maybe for about 10 minutes, read some short passages. And the passages really really reflecting some of these facets of the collection I've talked about. So the first one is just these everyday spaces, and it's called Aeroplane, and I guess in a way the illustration is a very beautiful cover that I really like of the new version, also has this paper aeroplane in. And it's partly autobiographical. It does emerge from a certain kind of context, just visiting my mother-in-law's, house in the evenings and seeing what happens there. So this is Aeroplane. Jin Jin, not now. Later we can fold a paper plane. But now we all have things to do. Your grandmother is watching her movie on TV. I've got something I have to write. Do your Chinese homework. Look, you can sit here at the table with me. Put a cushion on the chair so you can reach. No pencil. Ask Yati. She's sure to have one. Outside, a light breeze before rain. When the music from the television fades, sounds from beyond the house gather again. The wash of traffic on the recently widened road. Voices raised, anxious, but too far away to understand. The ceiling wax palm in the garden stirs. We wait for the patter of water on tiles, on the roof of the car, or, soon enough, the rattle of a bolt drawn back and the creeping open of the gate. First Jinjin's mother, my sister-in-law, then other family members, settling like migratory birds at my mother-in-law's house in that golden hour before dinner. 妈妈你看什么电影啊? She's watching Air Hostess, my mother-in-law tells me in Mandarin. Look, watch the star, Gerlan. See how she tilts her head when she smiles. See what she tells her mother, tells Xiang, the boring boyfriend. She's thought about this career move that she's made deeply. She wants to take off, to fly into the blue sky. She doesn't want to be a canary in a cage, no matter how beautifully she can sing. And she can sing very beautifully. Later, we will have the O Calypso song in the movie, but now it's only background music that swells. Miss Kung steps out, leading her new recruits proudly onto the apron. They wear high heels, pencil-slim skirts, and tiny blue-grey berets that nestle miraculously on their heads. Behind them are the waiting planes, white as birds flocking behind the green of mountains. I turn back to the table. Opposite me, Jinjin hovers over her homework, head down, elbows sticking out, her exercise book ruffled by the fan. On my laptop are photographs and documents that I need to lay out, one by one, into a story. A portrait of a young man with a trilby and a cheap suitcase standing by a waiting plane. No mountains here, only a flat expanse of grass. Then PDFs of colonial office records, their covers turned deep brown with age. Even here on the screen, you can almost recall their musty smell, how you were afraid they would fall to pieces in your hands under the watchful cameras of the reading room. I shift on the chair, trying to catch the breeze of the fan. Newspaper columns with bold titles. Another year for detainees. Freedom at last. The big split. Opposition leaders detained. Suicide attempt in prison. Exile or detention. PM's offer to Lim Chin-siong. Released to go abroad for studies. Below, the march of headlines. The print diminishes to the size of ants, trailing away into the darkness. Academic articles are much easier to read. Bright, angular, and solid, their references marshaled as neatly as the air hostesses on the tarmac. It's even easier to watch the movie. Gerlan is on her first flight. The propellers turn, slowly at first, then fast enough to seem as if they're spinning backwards. The plane lumbers along, impossibly heavy, and gathers speed for takeoff. The music returns. The aeroplane seems to float in a blue sky empty of anything but clouds. In the cabin, the passengers behave much as expected. There's a terrified woman who clutches Gerlan's hand and will not let go, a lecherous middle-aged man to be engaged in conversation and then avoided, a greedy passenger who wants 2 bowls of soup and wants them now. Uncle, Jinjin, one moment, I'm working. Can I ask you a question? Okay. Your legs, why so hairy? Because I come from a country very far north, very cold in winter. I need to be warm. Like a polar bear. Yeah, very like, yeah. Now do your homework. Write out those characters. If you don't practice over and over again, your writing is going to be as bad as mine. Look, you've hardly started. So I turn back to the screen. This shouldn't be taking so long. Short entries, the dictionary editors told me, will pay you per word, but only up to a certain limit. There's a knack to this, to summarize the lives of opposition leaders who are only footnotes in history, to give them a beginning, a middle, and an end. But history takes you on detours. It keeps you waiting. It never arrives on time. So maybe I'll just read, I mean, we'll see how things go in terms of rhythm, but I think for now I'll just probably read just one more passage, right? And I thought, although it's a little bit difficult to extract, I should do the Lee Kuan Yew visits UBC Campus one, right? So he was staying at the faculty club, right? Which is now the Peter Wall Center for Advanced Studies or something like that at the top of the rise. And it just so happened that when LKY arrived, And he came in 1968, so he'd been Prime Minister of an independent Singapore for 3 years. He was pretty exhausted. He wanted to rest. He was on his way to Harvard. He had about a week here, and he wanted some quiet, and they put him up at the top of the faculty club, right, in these very nice rooms that I think don't exist anymore. I don't know if they're still there or not, but I don't think so. And then it just so happens that 1968 is, of course, the Democratic Convention is happening in Chicago, right? And Jerry Rubin, the yippie, comes up to UBC. Right? Now, it's interesting in this cross-border stuff. I'm not quite sure what's going on here in terms of politics, so maybe someone could explain it to me what he's doing in Canada. But he comes up, and there's a massive rally outside the Heb Theatre, as it was then, and the sub, which was already constructed, I think, by then, the old bit of the sub. And then the students decide to occupy the faculty club. And so they come in and they liberate the faculty club. And Lee Kuan Yew is still upstairs. So I can't obviously do the whole story, but I thought I'd just do the beginning of the story. And the beginning is when a graduate student who's going to be the central character in the story meets this rather intriguing person who she doesn't know who he is in the bus stop cafe, which some of you who are old enough might just remember, right? Okay. And she's also, there's just one more conceit to mention before I read. She is learning Chinese, and so she uses flashcards. And she writes out the flashcards, and she writes out the Chinese on one side and the English on the other. So the beginning of the story is called Forbidden Cities, and the beginning is just a reading out of flashcards. Zao Chan, early morning. Fu Xi, review, revise. Liu Wang, go into exile. 自由, freedom. 自爱, self-respect. You're learning Chinese. I fumble with my flashcards of Chinese characters, upsetting the little pile I've built for myself on the cafe counter. The man who just sat down apologizes. He didn't mean to startle me. He, like me, is waiting for the waitress with her beehive hair, polyester apron, and bright early morning smile. Coffee first. We turn our cups right side up in expectation. As he talks, he rebuilds my pile of cards, pushing away my hands. He was impressed, he said, to see someone like me studying Chinese, the language of the future. The coffee comes. He stares in puzzlement at the creamer, so I pick it up, look at him with raised eyebrows, and when he nods, stir it into his coffee. I order my usual bagel and cream cheese. After a quick scan of the menu, he chooses an English cooked breakfast. He reaches out to me, a hand to me. Lee, Tessa Marshall. I'm a student at UBC in Asian Studies. He's finished reassembling my cards. They are all stacked up in the neatest pile I've ever seen. So perfect, I feel I never want to touch them again. I add 5 cards a day, I say, sometimes twice a day if I can. Things I come across and look up in the dictionary. Then I put aside the 5 cards I know best. Mr. Lee nods approvingly. He tells me he's just arrived in Vancouver. He didn't realize Asian Studies was offered at UBC. His hosts on campus are from the business school. He looks away over the clatter of cutlery through the glass window to the trees on the main mall, still clinging to their leaves. A sky grey with high cloud, and the dark finger of the clock tower raised towards us. I can't place his accent. Not English, not American, but fully at ease with the language. If I closed my eyes and listened, I would say he was from India. Looking at him without listening, I might think he was an affluent uncle visiting my host family in Taiwan. There's something solid about him. I push my hair back and resolve to tie it before attending this morning's lecture. You've come here on sabbatical. He smiles. You might say that. You're a professor? No. Something about the way he says this makes me feel rebuked, as though I'm a small child who cannot possibly understand these things. Our food arrives, and we could not be more different in the way we eat. I chew on the bagel, wiping away surplus cream cheese from the corners of my mouth with a napkin. He cuts his cooked breakfast into small, perfectly formed parcels that are conveyed with astonishing regularity into his mouth, wielding his knife or fork like surgical instruments. Eating perhaps mollifies him. When he's finished, he's more conciliatory. I'm a politician, he offers, from Singapore. I do my best to look intelligent. I'm here to rest a little, to stand back and to think. He says he's staying in the faculty club with its tired menus, its fuggy bar with Bass ale and liquors, its half-baked pastiche of a Cambridge senior common room. He's been dining there, but for breakfast today he thought he would escape, leave his secretary behind and explore the campus. It's good, he tells me, to meet young Canadians like myself, rather than a parade of officials, dignitaries and hangers-on. What I say takes him back to his own undergraduate days in England after the war. Only 20 years previous, but the 1960s seem very different from the late 1940s. He too has changed. It now seems to be, to him, a lifetime ago. When the bills come, he pays mine, brushing my protests aside. As we get up to leave the cafe, he puts on a hat and an immaculately tailored coat. I'm conscious of my shabbiness, slipping on the baggy army surplus trench coat with fraying waistband I borrowed at Sean's house this morning. Lee gestures I've missed a loop in the belt and waits until I rethread it. As he opens the door, there's a sigh of cold air. We walk together up the mall. The trees are dark, branches bare, and beautiful fallen leaves in brown heaps, the pavement wet, the mountains are visible under cloud. At this time of year, I tell him, you might visit Vancouver and never realize there are mountains at all. Has he seen them? And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you for that wonderful reading, Philip. It was lovely to hear you voice your characters. I think maybe we'll start with a question that sort of encapsulates the sort of roving character of the short stories, and it's the fact that the voice feels consistent, but it jumps from Singapore to England to Western Canada. And I think what binds them for me is that in each location, the character offers perspectives on, struggling of belonging or fitting in. And even in one story you write, in my life, in my body, things shifted after Taiwan. You learn to make yourself small. You leave a world you have known and enter a world of strangers. And in that moment, loneliness comes and never leaves you, even when the strangers become friends. And I was wondering if you meant for that sort of theme to be threaded throughout the book.
Thanks. That's a nice quote. I think that quote actually is from the same story, if I'm not wrong. It's actually from the one I just read, the second one, Forbidden Cities. Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting question. So I think for me, there certainly are elements of that theme throughout all the different stories. So this thing about when you go away, and people may have this experience here too, and graduate students who are here especially may have this experience, that when you go away for the first time from a place you've grown up in, and you come back, it's never the same again, right? You always will see it in a different kind of way, even if you come back and belong. And even if you come back like these post-colonial leaders who actually spent some time and then came back and then died in Singapore. There will always be a slight sense of difference there. And then I think, yes, for some of the other characters, there's a more profound sense of being at loss. So some people do actually really feel a sense of loss and cannot find a home. And then others, I think, try to make a home as they go. So I think it's probably, you're right, this theme is there. And then there's a range of different positions that people take with reference to this theme. But everybody, just about in the stories, I think, is going through this process of moving between different worlds. And this moving between different worlds might not even just be in between different geographical areas. Like I'm thinking of my mother-in-law's generation, which was sort of, she's the grandmother in the house at the beginning. And she's gone through another kind of shift, which is when she was a child and when she was a young woman, really she was part of a Chinese-speaking environment, right? And now in Singapore, Chinese is, Malay is no longer the lingua franca, and Chinese is spoken less often in certain public situations. So even people who've stayed in the same place, paradoxically, have also gone through that process of dislocation.
It's interesting though, because family is actually a big theme in here. They are feeling alone, but they always have someone there. or they're moving from. There's a story about someone wanting to fit in their in-laws' family and that. And so, what do you feel that your characters are kind of wanting a change? I feel like they're going up against something in their life and they want a change in a relationship or their own personal endeavors. What do you feel is the biggest struggle that your characters face?
Yeah, that's interesting. And again, I mean, it's kind of curious too, because quite a lot of the characters, especially in the Vancouver stories, are academics, right? And my editor, Ime, was actually wonderful, sort of said to me, like, can you change the characters a bit there? I mean, are these characters rather similar in the end? They're these kind of like slightly agonized academics. So there is a certain sense in which there's a repeated certain kind of character who's maybe someone who is sort of in between spaces and is on two processes of discovery, right? So one process would be some kind of sense of trying to place yourself in history by doing work in archives and understanding archives. And I think I'd be interested you to speak to this too, because you're someone who's done a lot of work in archives too, but how you might find things in archives which actually reflect yourself in some kind of way or empower yourself, right? And then the second one is family. And I think for me also, I'm not sure if we talk about all the individual characters, but I think there were sort of two things about me. One is in Singapore, acquiring a new family that I married into with my partner and getting to know that family, and especially my parents-in-law, having that sort of quite deep relationship with them. And the second one was also, as I aged too, I think I mentioned too, my relationship with my father, and that sort of changing, and that becoming more important. Like maybe in my 20s, I was just escaping and getting away, and now these things came back. Right? Yeah. But can you? I'm interested in your thought about the archives, because I know you looked at Newell at Sparks Archive. I mean, did you find something there that spoke to you? That.
I think I did. I liked what you said about how archives they're never complete. They're very, it's a snapshot of what is there and whatnot. And I liked how you said that you have to work around the gray areas, and that was a question that I had as well. And in terms of my work and looking at, I'm a poet who looks at different archives and uses that as sources of inspiration. I think you have to play with the concepts of truth there. And I noticed that you said that used material from the UBC archives about his visit here.
Yeah.
And then that was interesting that's sort of a ground for writers to imagine what could be, the possibilities of what only the artifact means, but what also happened there. And, you play around the boundaries of truth between what is known and what is written. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And you use other archives too. So in poetry, you never really lie, or you don't really, you create scenarios, but it's slightly different because you stick within the boundaries of the lyric. But I was wondering in fiction and the archive, how did you find that to intersect?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think I also have thought about this too. I think in the first collection, right, so this one, in which Lee Kuan Yew appears in a couple of stories, I hadn't quite worked it out. So they were almost two rather separate things for me. And then what I did was I would sort of take a moment. So there's two stories. There's one, the one we talked about at UBC, and there's another one about Pierre Trudeau and Lee Kuan Yew meeting up together in London in 1949, which they could have done. And they go to a pub and they have a drink and things happen. This could have happened. They both were there. Right? But I think there I was playing around. I was quite confident about doing these things, and I was quite confident about entering the consciousness of, say, Pierre Trudeau or Lee Kuan Yew. I think the second set of stories, which have become much more archivally dense, actually have come out of a larger research project. And the project actually was centered on S. Rajaratnam and his time in London. And so it became a rather different interest. It was something like this. At a certain point when I researched Rajaratnam, and I did actually write an academic article about his time in London too, the archive ran out. And yet there were all these really fascinating things you can do, but you can't really put them into academic work, right? So one thing was I went to visit the houses he lived in. What was the boarding house he actually lived in physically like? And the fascinating thing is you get to talk to the person lives in the space now, and they show you around, and then other stories start accumulating. So that kind of physical space, what do I do with that? I mean, I can mention it in the research. The second thing is actually in Singapore, what tends to happen is that people like Rajaratnam or Lee Kuan Yew or Goh Keng Swee are celebrated as national heroes. And so the biographies of them that tend to be written are kind of hagiographic. They're sometimes, I wouldn't say they're badly researched, they're often written by journalists, right? Or maybe very, very sympathetic people. Nothing wrong with that. And these people are sometimes given privileged access to archives. So I could never I could never write a biography of Rajaratnam in that kind of way. So then I started thinking about what can one do with the archive. And the first thing I started doing was not yet fiction, right? And I discovered this concept called critical fabulation, which is an American historian, Saida Hartman, who's developed. And for her, it is what she, and she devises it for a very, very different kind of reason than I was doing it. So she wants to describe slavery and the violence of slavery. And the archive that remains is all written by the slave owners. There's very little that's written by slaves themselves. So what does she do? What she does is she patches other things, other experiences into non-fiction. She doesn't invent anything. But rather than, what she doesn't say is also, she doesn't say, I'm ventriloquizing. She doesn't say, I am going to speak for these slaves. But I am going to, in producing this kind of work of writing which is like visible mending almost, right? In which the stitches are obvious. I will show what has been admitted. I will patch it in, right? So she was actually very influential on me. I did some work like that. And then I thought, I can go even further than I can do fiction. But I think that my fiction is, the more recent fiction is more constrained in the sense that I no longer try to enter into the consciousness of these historical actors, but I've actually chosen another character who interacts with them, just because I felt that was more honest in a way and less speculative.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's funny when you said the archive runs out. You know, it doesn't really, obviously that's a funny way of saying it because it doesn't run out, it just stops.
Yeah.
And that can be a disappointment if you have expectations for it, or you have to learn to judge your expectations of the archive between what is actually there. And then you mentioned, you know, physical space, and that's one thing with my session with Madeline Tiem last month, and how you try to learn about one person and you visit their archive, and what you don't see, you try to find yourself. And she was mentioning going to, following Hannah Arendt's travels, and I did the same with Muriel Spark, also I live in the same place. I wondered though about that story you mentioned with Trudeau and Lee Kuan Yew, and the one where they see each other in London, you know, and they're in the pub for like one drink, and he leaves behind his satchel, and then he doesn't, and he decides at the end not to return it.
Yes,
You know, and then he sees, you know, the British lion, which is obviously the symbol of, you know, imperialism, etc. And so I was curious, why did he decide not to return it?
That's very interesting. So, I mean, to some degree, the satchel is a kind of MacGuffin, right? It's a way of getting the narrative going, right? So Pierre leaves his satchel, and okay, well, he has to return it, and he finds inside the satchel that Pierre's got a date with someone, and so he has to go to the date too, and then he decides not to. I think it was, and then what happens is it's actually in, like you say, in London Zoo. And there is the British lion of imperialism, but there's also another layer to the lion and to the... so basically he sees these mangy tigers, he doesn't like them. And the tiger is a symbol of Malaya. It's a symbol of the polity that Lee Kuan Yew would leave. He will leave Malaysia. And then the lion is also connected to Singapore, the lion city, right? So he sees the lion in the cage, and he kind of wonders, because he sees this space I guess, so there's the zoo, but the zoo in which the animals are kind of presented in a semi-natural kind of state. So, and then he sort of thinks, well, if the lion, what would happen to the lion if I was to let the lion out? Or would if I was to take away the bar, would he still stay inside the cage? So I think in a way what's happening is that he's almost thinking of, in a funny way, of governance in Singapore. And it's a playful kind of thing. It's a playful play with the possibilities of governance in Singapore. And then I think he's just too impatient. He wants to get on with history. He doesn't want to be bogged down by these kind of emotional obligations. And so therefore he just leaves, and I think he gets on the train back to Cambridge, which is where he's come from, where he was going to. Yeah. So that was a sort of, in a way, it's partly, the satchel is partly a way of just moving the plot along, but then it starts becoming something else, right? And it's probably to do with that hidden away private emotion versus that public narrative of political success.
No, I remember the hot date. I was
Yeah,
hoping it was Kim Cattrall. Or
I know, yeah.
I was wondering about, you mentioned a lot about fathers and uncles in your book, and which I see there because you write a lot about historical figures, and you don't villainize them, and you don't try to portray them. You try to portray them as rounded, individuals. But I also thought a lot of your stories, though, have a female perspective.
Yes, yeah.
And so, but that wasn't one of your themes. And I thought, well, I wondered about how you present fathers and uncles. And I feel like the women in your stories, they don't understand the men in their lives, and they're working to understand this, particularly in the story where the client, the female therapist,
Yes.
and her male client. And I wondered how you felt about creating men that were enigmatic or hard to read, and women who are lots of times they are your protagonists, but they're often also in a nurturing role. So I wondered if you could maybe say a bit about that, how you decide to create these archetypes in your book.
Yeah. That's such a really interesting observation, and I think I felt I don't simply want to write about men. But I have been very interested all my life in issues of masculinity, definitely, and masculine performance and masculine identity and that kind of thing. So yes, there is definitely, and also I think for me, how it's connected with things like, for instance, governance, and it's connected with certain kind of public roles that, say, politicians play, or careers that are taken on. And you're right about the women. What I hope is entering into the women characters gives another kind of perspective. And I hope it's not simply a coding where the men become sort of rationality and the women become emotion or something like that. But certainly in these relationships, maybe in these intimate relationships, I think some of the kind of maybe rigid structures of masculinity in these stories get a little bit loosened, right? So maybe that's a way in which those two, the gender dynamic actually works. But you're actually very right. I think that a central concern often is with the relationship with the national father or the father, right? And I'm curious, I don't worry about my mother, who actually passed away before my father and passed away very suddenly, right? And I'm not quite, perhaps because the time the original collection was being written was actually the last few years of my father's life. So I wonder if that's why that entered into it and why I didn't focus on certainly mothers as well. Doesn't fully answer your question.
No, it's definitely. I think women are definitely there, and in things. But I was curious about how you felt about your own themes, and how obviously others can see other themes in them. I was wondering about your view of Singapore in this book. You present a very contemporary view of Singapore, and also your view of language. Would you consider the book to be somewhat bilingual because of, or is it really the bilingualism is an aspect of the characters? There's, one character is hesitantly learning Mandarin, and the other one has flashcards, and I wondered if those two things are connected. If you talk about the role of language in your book, and also the view of Singapore, if that's somewhat connected. Yeah.
No, I think there's a definite connection. So I think Singapore is a multilingual environment in which, in many given situations, it's very, very rare to have, say you've got a group of people in a room, and as long as it's not the university or something like that, but it's a domestic situation, you'll have people of different generations who have access to different languages and competences of different languages, but you'll probably have nobody who has fluency in, say, four languages that are going on, because there will be English, say in a Chinese family, there'll be English, there'll be Mandarin, and there'll be at least one so-called dialect. And there'll also be, often in Singapore, a foreign domestic helper will be Indonesian, and so there'll be Malay as well. So I'm kind of interested. I think for me, and this long sort of process in my life of struggling with Mandarin and never being completely fluent in it, I think for me has been kind of interesting that what I get very interested in is situations of language learning and situations of incomprehension and jokes and mistakes in language, because I think that often happens, a miscommunication. So what about a daughter who can only communicate to her mother in a language she learned in childhood? And so when she talks, she becomes a child, because there's no other way of communicating. Those kind of issues are very... And are they particular to Singapore? They're probably not particular to Singapore, but they are focused often in Singapore, just because of that incredible modernization and change in society that happened over the last 50 or 60 years. It's this hyper-modern society that's come from this colonial port city. So often I think these issues of language are symptomatic of some larger changes and larger incommunications and larger forgettings of pasts that can then be brought out into the present.
Does it mirror your own relationship with learning Mandarin, then the sort of not disruptive, but the interventions of language in the story, as you know, as visual aspects to it as well? Does that mirror your own relationship?
Yeah, I think definitely in the story that I just read with the flashcards, that definitely was my own experience in learning at the time. And certainly the other one I also read from Aeroplane, I think it does draw very strongly upon my own experiences in that particular setting. I mean, the story actually goes on, and it goes on, actually it's a pun on a dialect phrase that has a certain kind of... so it's also got Chinese dialects in too, which is interesting for me because I have some competence in Mandarin. If there's simple Mandarin being spoken, I'm fine. I can address and talk to people in Mandarin. But in terms of so-called Chinese dialects, Hokkien, or if you want to call regional languages, other Sinitic languages, whatever you want to call them, because there's the politics in what you call them, right? I can understand some, but I can't reproduce the tonal pattern. I've never been taught, because, Hokkien is supposed to have 7 or 8 tones. I'm not sure exactly what, right? So I can... So yes, definitely those experiences come from my own personal experiences. I'm trying to think if there's other stories where they might be more abstract, but certainly those two stories, they definitely come from personal experiences.
Just one more question before we open up to the audience. I was wondering about the role of counseling and storytelling, you know, especially in Mudskipper and other stories where the person sort of... there are good cues in there for how to listen, you know, and I feel like that story itself is a lot about listening to the past, listening to people who have different experiences for you. And how can that be how can using those sort of therapeutic techniques be a pathway into fiction?
Oh, that's so interesting. I mean, so I think certainly one of the things you learn very early on in any decent counselling training is to listen. And one of the realizations you come to is that generally we don't listen enough, and people are often just quite overwhelmed if you're seeing someone as a client by the fact that someone is listening to them for the first time. So you're right about that idea of listening, and I think that probably works its way into the stories in a way. I think also for me, in terms of how counselling entered the stories in other ways, in terms of counselling techniques, I did become interested in a time in a branch of counselling called narrative therapy, and I also have some questions about it. But narrative therapy would say something like, what happens is we pick up from the world outside us stories of how we should be, right? and often we internalize them. And a therapeutic intervention might be telling your story, but actually realizing that that story doesn't fit you anymore, and devising a story that fits yourself better. So, for instance, classic example, someone who comes and feels they are a bad mother, right? But through realization, through working, actually you realize that that's actually not the case, right? I think, just to say this, 'cause I know there's some graduate students here, I think at university there's a very, very powerful, if you become a graduate student, as a doctoral student especially, there's a very powerful story that the only success can be to get the tenure-track job, right? And so many people become very unhappy because that doesn't happen, right? Whereas there's so many other possibilities and alternatives are possible. So I think that certainly came into the idea of the story, that there's healing stories, and there's also negative stories that you want to try and escape from, that are imposed upon you. And then I think also just the dramatic situation of counselling and listening to each other became very central to at least a couple of the stories. That sort of listening, being listened to, and then, yes, you're right, and then power dynamics changing in the course of counselling, because maybe the client actually knows more than the counsellor actually does. Yeah.
I thought that was really beautiful, and your style of writing really captures each, I suppose, step towards a resolution. My last question is, because there's two books on the table, both of which are kind of the same. Also, one with an additional 4 stories. So I wondered, what did you wish most for these books, and did you fulfill that? And has it changed in the 10 years between the first edition and now this enlarged edition?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the first one, in a way, it was a sort of expression of my life in Singapore. And I had a big launch, I think it was part of Singapore Writers Festival. And like everybody who I kind of knew came, in a way, or many people mattered to me came. And so it was kind of, it was almost a kind of celebration of a kind of a reflection of a life, and coming to feel very much at home, because it's sort of published by Epigram, who are one of Singapore's sort of major two publishers at the time, certainly. And it was very well received, and I got a lot of very kind comments from friends and things about that, who I really respected. The second one is actually interesting because, okay, since 2016, we've been having this peripatetic life back and forth from Singapore and spending quite a lot of time in Vancouver. And of course, I trained in Vancouver. So in a way, I think an odd way, in this collection, because of the licensing rights, is only available in North America. So it's not actually published in Singapore. It's published in Canada and the US. I think for me, this was a kind of, it's a slightly more distant from Singapore, right? It's the new stories. I took out some stories that were very immediately about Singapore, like that kind of being in Singapore environments. And the stories I put back in were much more historical in nature, right? And so it's more kind of trying to reflect upon a certain place in history. And then the other thing that came in, started coming back, was London. And it's very strange because like one of the things that you do if you do life review work is that there's supposed to be this thing called the reminiscence bump in life, which is that you remember, if you're of my age or older, you actually remember your late teens and 20s much, much more vividly than you remember things in your 50s. In general, there's a difference, but this is quite common. And so for me, there was that time in London, being a graduate student, going into this world that's of difference, right? And I found I could channel that back into the stories. So channel the Rajaratnam story is about his own experiences in London, and also channel more recent things like the counselling experience. Being a new counsellor, being a nervous counsellor, being not at all confident of what I'm doing, was actually, I can invent a character like that, and then I can enter into that.
Great. Okay, I think we'll end there. I just want to say thank you to Philip, thank you to his publisher, thank you to Green College, and obviously Heather, Emma, Gracia, and Sarah, everyone here. I want to say that Philip's book is being sold in the corner there by UBC Bookstore, so thank you so much. And I hope you all join us in the piano lounge across the way to talk to Philip more and to join us for the reception there. And thank you to our online audience. You guys were great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.